When I say the phrase follow Jesus, maybe you imagine yourself walking behind the Lord with his 12 disciples as they journey on the dusty roads of Galilee. I think today's reading paints a remarkably different picture of what it means to follow Jesus. Here, following Jesus means trying to keep up with a highly precocious, energetic child as he makes his way through a crowded city, a child who has no intention of staying put and doing what you want him to do. If you've read the New Testament in its entirety, and I'm sure many of you have, you'll notice that the Gospels are mostly silent on Jesus' childhood years. The one biblical account that we have of Jesus' childhood is found in Luke chapter 2, and it's the famous story of Jesus being left behind on vacation. So basically it's the plot of Home Alone 2, Lost in New York. I find this story unsettling. I find it unsettling, and I find it unsettling because of the core message that it conveys. And the message is as follows. Jesus' mission is to do his Father's will and not what others expect of him. Right? I'm going to say that again. Jesus' mission is to do his Father's will and not what other people expect of him. And I suspect that every disciple of Jesus, you and I included, are eventually going to have to learn this difficult lesson, as Mary and Joseph definitely learned that lesson in today's story. So, I really want to get into this. It's 9 AD, give or take, and Mary and Joseph, along with their fellow Jews, are poised to celebrate the festival of the Passover. And you know that this is hands down the most significant day on the Jewish calendar. Now, at this point in Jewish history, it was not required for Jews to celebrate the festival in Jerusalem. But Jesus' family, A, because they live relatively close by, and because they're a pious family, do celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. In fact, we're told by Luke that they make this pilgrimage every year. So for them, it would have been like a roughly 80-mile journey south, which, assuming they were covering about 20 miles a day, probably would have taken them like 3 or 4 days, depending on their pace. And bear in mind, Mary and Joseph wouldn't have just like loaded up the family station wagon, put Jesus in, and then made this trip by themselves alone. They would have traveled with this caravan of other pilgrims and relatives and all of their neighbors from Nazareth, because you have to remember that this is the ancient world. And in the ancient world, long-distance travel was really hazardous. And if you're traveling alone on the road, there's an excellent chance you're going to get robbed and beaten and killed by bandits. Large numbers of people, on the other hand, offered some degree of safety and protection for the travelers. So, Mary and Joseph and Jesus, along with this huge caravan of Galilean pilgrims, arrive in the city of Jerusalem. They celebrate the feast of Passover. And a few days pass, maybe, and then now it's time to go back home. So one morning, they're frantically packing all of their bags. They make one last trip to the market to get some stuff. Mary and Joseph, along with their kith and kin, then just set out for that long northern journey to Nazareth. And this is, of course, when Mary and Joseph get the fright of their life. As they make that slow journey north, basically, mom and dad blissfully assume that Jesus is somewhere among the band of pilgrims, right? Maybe he's walking with an uncle or an aunt. Maybe he's playing with a group of family friends. You have to bear in mind this is like 2,000 years before helicopter parenting. Jesus, I assure you, did not have a cell phone, and neither did Mary and Joseph. So it isn't until the sun starts to set and the pilgrims proceed to pitch their tents that Mary and Joseph go around and they're looking for Jesus in the crowd. So maybe Mary goes to her closest relative, let's say a brother or a sister, and says, was Jesus with you today? Because he needs to come to our tent now. He needs to get into his pajamas, brush his teeth. We're going to bed in about 5 minutes. But she's met with this blank stare. And her relative says, I haven't seen Jesus. He must have been with someone else. Go ask your cousin Benjamin. He must know where the boy is. So Mary and Joseph go from one family to the next, and they're asking, have you seen our boy, Jesus, today? Was he with your kids? Was he playing with your sons? And with every negative response, Mary and Joseph just get more and more scared, more and more panicked. And finally, overcome with this sense of tremendous dread and anxiety, Mary just collapses into Joseph's arms. And the couple basically are forced to admit Jesus is lost, and he's probably back in Jerusalem where everybody saw him last. And I think those of you who are parents know this feeling of sudden panic when maybe you're in a crowd and you realize that the small child you're responsible for, your son or your daughter, is missing. Take that sense of fear and anxiety and worry, multiply it by 10. That's how Mary and Joseph feel when, evening rolls around, they realize that Jesus is like 20 miles back in Jerusalem, alone. And so they make this grueling 20-mile journey south. They're already exhausted. They show up in Jerusalem, and immediately they start searching. And they walk along the avenues of the city, and they're calling for Jesus. They wander down these narrow alleyways. They're calling for Jesus. They patrol the city market. They're questioning vendors. Maybe they took turns. We don't know. And the hours wear on. A whole day passes. Jesus is nowhere to be seen. Nowhere. Finally, at some point on the third day, Mary and Joseph find themselves in the temple. And maybe this is their very first time searching the temple. Maybe they had been there a couple times before. We don't really know. But as they wander around the temple courts, they notice something strange. There's a small knot of men, and they look like Torah scholars, and they're all gathered around a corner of a room, around a pillar or something, and they're in deep conversation with one another. And curious, they approach the group of men, and maybe Joseph thinks to himself, look, I could just ask him if they've seen a 12-year-old boy running around here by himself, unaccompanied. And then they see him, right? They see Jesus. They see their son. And at first, neither of them can believe their eyes. I think initially Mary wants to push through the crowd and grab Jesus and hug him tight. But as her eyes take in this bizarre scene unfolding before her, she holds back. And what's going on? Well, Jesus is, to quote Luke, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. And not only is he asking questions about Torah, the Torah scholars are starting to question him. According to Luke, the men in the temple were really impressed by Jesus' responses. As Luke writes, all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and answers. So basically, it's not just that Jesus knows Bible trivia. It's not just that he could name major characters in the Bible. No, he has this rich understanding of the laws and customs and stories and teachings and wisdom literature of his people, and he's able to weave all these elements of Judaism together into this coherent picture of God's love for Israel and for the world. And meanwhile, Mary and Joseph, they're taking all of this in, and they're experiencing this bizarre emotional cocktail, right? Because, of course, they're relieved. Like, here's Jesus. We've been looking for him everywhere, and he's safe. He's okay. Maybe they feel pride because he's having this discussion, this theological discussion with Israel's wisest teachers. But eventually, in Mary's heart, this new emotion comes up, and it's anger. In fact, it's a mom's anger, which is probably the worst kind of anger you could deal with. And she says, child, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been worried sick, looking for you. And I believe that Jesus' exasperating reply is the key to unlocking the meaning of this passage of Scripture. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to pause, and I want to briefly address a really relevant debate regarding the translation of this verse, which is Luke 2:49, okay? There are basically two main ways of translating the response that Jesus gives his mother. In most Bibles, probably in the Bible you have at home, it says something like this: why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? But the thing is, the Greek word for house, oikos, doesn't actually appear at all in that sentence. It's just assumed to be there. It's plugged in to make it make sense. If you were to look at this verse and just do a strict wooden translation, like a word for word, it would sound like this: did you not know that in the something of my Father it is necessary for me to be? And at this point in the sentence where I said something, there's this plural article that translators really don't know what to do with. So some people have suggested that maybe a better translation would be, did you not know that I must be about the things of my Father? In fact, that's more or less the King James translation of this passage of Scripture, right? Wist ye not that I be about my Father's business? So there's a stained glass depiction of this scene right here in Stone Church. It's actually in our office of Jesus talking to the teachers of the law. And in the text underneath that window, it says that translation, wist ye not I must be about my Father's business? And Jazz and I joke that when we're lazy and sitting in our office not doing work, we just look at that sign. It's a reminder we got to be about our Father's business, right? But for me, that translation makes the most sense. So again, poor flustered Mary is talking to her child. Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety. And Jesus replies, why were you looking for me? Didn't you know I must be about my Father's business? So in other words, there was never any need for you, Mom and Dad, to wonder where I am or what I'm doing. You should know that wherever I go, whatever I'm doing what my Father is calling me to do. So today, my Father needed me discussing Torah with teachers of the law, and that's what I'm doing. And so here, I get back to what I stated earlier at the beginning of this little talk, right? Jesus' mission is to do the Father's will, not what others expect of him, not what the Jewish religious establishment expect of him, not what the Jewish peasants expect of him, not what the disciples expect of him, not what you and I expect of him, not even what his mother expects of him. What does Mary expect of Jesus in this story? Well, she expects Jesus to stay put with the rest of his cousins. But Jesus subverts Mary's expectations, and he stays in Jerusalem, and he talks Torah with biblical scholars. It drives her insane, drives her mad. When Jesus miraculously feeds a crowd of 5,000 people many years later, the crowds expect him to perform that miracle again and again and again so that their bellies might be full. Right? In fact, you'll remember, they want to make him a king for that reason. But instead, Jesus subverts those expectations, declaring in so many words that he hasn't been sent to fill people's bellies with bread, but their souls with his Spirit. When Jesus gathers a group of disciples, they expect him to do what the Messiah is supposed to do, which is raise up an army, drive out the hated pagans from Israel, and reign forever in Jerusalem as king. But Jesus is clear. That's not my Father's will for me. That's not what God wants me to do. Instead, I've got to go to Jerusalem, experience betrayal and suffering, and be killed and rise again. And that, of course, is the ultimate subversion of expectations, right, when it comes to Jesus. And I think today's story in Luke's gospel foreshadows that. And I want you to think about this. In what we call Holy Week, Jesus goes to Jerusalem. When? During the Passover feast, right? While there, he's crucified and buried. In a manner of speaking, he goes missing. For how long? Just like in today's story, 3 days. Only to appear again on the third day, surprising everybody, his disciples, and once again, poor Mary, who's been on a roller coaster emotionally with Jesus throughout the entire course of his life, for 30 or more years. And when his disciples questioned Jesus about all of this, saying more or less what Mary did in today's story, why have you done this to us? Jesus' response to his disciples is more or less the same. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? In other words, basically, didn't you know I must be about my Father's business? When I say the phrase follow Jesus, maybe you imagine yourself walking behind the Lord with his 12 disciples as they journey on the dusty roads of Galilee. I think today's reading paints a remarkably different picture of what it means to follow Jesus. Here, following Jesus means trying to keep up with a highly precocious, energetic child as he makes his way through a crowded city, a child who has no intention of staying put and doing what you want him to do. For a while, you might actually be doing a decent job in keeping up with him, but then you round a corner and he isn't there. So you search for him. You try to anticipate where he might show up next. In fact, you may even catch a glimpse of him off in the distance hopping a fence or a wall, but he disappears again. And then finally, when you're on the brink of giving up the hope of ever seeing him again, you find him in this moment when you least expected to see him, in the place where you least expected to find him. And so you rejoice and you run to embrace him. But he's gone again. That's what discipleship looks like. We go where we feel Jesus is calling us to go, right? I know many of you have. We do what we feel Jesus wants us to do. So we get baptized, right? Or we start that career, or we launch that ministry, or that business, or that nonprofit, or we marry that special person, and we start the family, and we go on the missions trip, or we write the book. Whatever you feel it is God is calling you to do, you do it. But it's hard, right? And we fail, right? We fail as partners and spouses and husbands and wives and parents and priests and so on. And nothing goes as we expected when we first set out on the journey with Jesus. And we wonder, where is he? Why isn't he doing what I expected him to do when I said yes to his call on my life? And when you think about it, it's not really Jesus' fault. I think we have only ourselves to blame for all of those unmet expectations about our journey with Jesus. Because Jesus tried to warn us. Repeatedly, he tried to warn us. At length, he says to his disciples over and over again, this is going to be hard. You're going to have to make a lot of sacrifices. You're going to have to suffer. They're going to reject you. You yourself are going to sin. Peter, before the cock crows, you are going to deny having known me 3 times. And Peter's like, yeah, I know. Whatever. I'll go with you to death if I have to. Before we even say yes to following Jesus, he tells us what to expect of him. And yet, when we embark on the journey, we cling to our own expectations of what it's supposed to look like. And then he upsets them. And like Mary and Joseph and the disciples, we get anxious and we get scared. But here's the comfort in today's story, and I'll leave you with this. Even though Jesus isn't doing what we expect him to do, he's doing what he's supposed to do. He's doing the will of his Father. And he's not just doing the will of his Father, he's doing the will of your Father too. And while the ways of the Father may be profoundly mysterious to us, even scary, they're ultimately good. As the apostle writes, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. You have been called according to God's purpose. So pursue that call, keep following Jesus, but bear in mind, please, he isn't necessarily leading you to where you expect him to take you. He hasn't been sent to do what you want him to do. He's been sent to do his Father's will.